I started researching this about maybe a little less than 10 years ago. And my interest was to figure out how school buildings were financed, because in Philadelphia, the buildings have been so toxic. And when you ask about where the money comes for school buildings, the first thing you encounter is Wall Street.
Hello and welcome to the Human Restoration Project podcast. My name is Nick Covington. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this episode is brought to you by our supporters, three of whom are Simeon Frang, Corinne Greenblatt, and Leah Kelly. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. We're proud to have hosted hundreds of hours of incredible ad-free conversations over the years. So if you haven't yet, consider liking and leaving a review in your podcast app to help us reach more listeners. And of course, you can learn more about Human Restoration Project on our website, humanrestorationproject.org, and connect with us everywhere on social media. We're recording this episode the week the Iowa DOGE Task Force released their final 136-page report. You heard that right. That's the state-level version of the Department of Government Efficiency convened by our governor back in February, tasked with maximizing return on investment of Iowa taxpayer dollars. As you can imagine, among their recommendations are ideas from the Return on Taxpayer Investment Working Group about improving education results, quote, aimed at delivering greater value for taxpayers, end quote. Fortunately for Iowans, this working group assembled a crack team of experienced education experts for the job, including the CEO of an ethanol plant, the former chair of the Iowa Racing and Gaming Commission, and the chair of a civil engineering firm. Among their recommendations are to, quote, establish a merit-based compensation framework, including a bonus structure, teacher professional development, and incentives for those in high-need schools in order to improve student outcomes and financially reward high-performing teachers, end quote. Merit pay is, of course, a tried, tested, and failed idea. But teacher salaries are just one thread in the complex tapestry of how states pay for public education and the ideological tug-of-war in our public debates over school funding. That's how we pay for buildings, pensions, special education, Title I, school food programs, every cost that goes into making schooling work or not. If the Iowa DOGE report and the policy agenda that'll inevitably follow could be titled as privatized as possible, doubling down on outcome-based school funding and accountability measures, and even recommending AI-based bus route optimization to, quote, cut costs and improve service, end quote. What's the alternative? Well, my guest today asks, quote, what would it mean to democratize school resources? What would it mean to have truly public schools, down to the very means of resource creation and distribution that fuels them? What will it take to make school as public as possible, end quote. It's also the title of his upcoming book, As Public as Possible, Radical Finance for America's Public Schools, out this December. You can pre-order it now from the New Press. David Backer is the author. He's an associate professor of education policy at Seton Hall University, whose research, teaching, and organizing focus on ideology and school finance. A former high school teacher, his research has appeared in a half dozen scholarly journals like the Harvard Education Review, as well as popular venues like the American Prospect and Jacobin. And you can find him on social media at School Daves. Thanks so much for joining me today, David Backer.
Thank you, Nick. It's so great to be here. I'm such a fan. You know, I follow your work. I've been following it for a while, so this is a real honor.
Yeah, I always love these conversations because even though we've not met to have this before, it feels like we're picking up in the middle of something rather than having to start from scratch.
That's right. Yeah, I know that you were talking about Doge, and I know you've been thinking about this stuff. So it's just like, the online to synchronous kind of interaction. It's so cool to really get to meet people.
We just get to let the audience in on the side conversations we've been having. So
right, exactly.
Before I encountered the book, here I was thinking that we pay local, state, federal taxes. Those tax dollars get appropriated and allocated on this per pupil basis to spend on things that schools need to function. And where there's a lack of equity, the federal government steps in to help fill those gaps. But as I was reading your book, it turns out that Wall Street investors are making tax-free profits off of debtor schools. Zoning and property assessments are rigged to keep rich schools rich. And Richard Nixon was right about replacing local property taxes with the federal value added tax. I had no idea. And I had shared this with you the other day and at the top of this conversation that this book really was radicalizing for me on that issue of school funding and finance. So, what in the world is going on here, man? How does our public school system fail at being as public as possible?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think it's been radicalizing for me too, because I got into this. I'm a philosopher by training, and I got into this as someone who's very active with education justice movements, people who are fighting in activist groups, unions, political groups who, want better schools to transform the schools. And a number of years ago, I was living in Philadelphia, and I just realized I didn't know how the money works, and particularly with school buildings. And I think that's important because I started researching this about maybe a little less than 10 years ago. And my interest was to figure out how school buildings were financed because in Philadelphia, the buildings have been so toxic. And when you ask about where the money comes for school buildings, the first thing you encounter is Wall Street. And as someone who had been studying anti-capitalism and been thinking about this, for a while before that, since Occupy Wall Street and before, I was just like, wow. And I think a pun that I use sometimes to think about, how it is that it's not as public as possible, or I even question sometimes what public means in this. When we say public education is public, what are we referring to exactly? Like, we're certainly referring to the sense that within a certain defined set of boundaries and like a ton of fine print, that's in 5-point font that no one can read, anyone, quote unquote, can go to school, right? And it is sort of, quote, free, unquote, at the point of service. But that fine print, when you start to look at it, you get your microscope out or whatever, you start to wonder. When you look at the ways in which private property, in particular, racialized private property structures this system, it's not clear to me that if public is supposed to mean a kind of for all, under some interpretation, whether or not this education that we have has been for all. And the pun that I sometimes use to think about this is the word values. So when we think about our values, you might think of these kind of very lofty, idealistic, democracy, participation, citizenship, you name it, whatever the trend of the moment is. But like, what's going on here in the finance system is a whole other set of values, and that's property values, and that's bond interest rate values or pension contribution values, discount rates, and the ways in which taxes are levied on certain kinds of values, whether it's the prices of things at the sales tax or on income or not. And so those values are really undermining those other values, right? They're in complete tension with one another. And yeah, this is sort of overall like a kind of picture that I've come to see.
Yeah, and I think before we get into a lot of those specifics, you almost have to turn over the rock of big finance, and then you'll find the interest rates, and you'll find bonds, and you'll find all these things under there. But I think you've mentioned that you'd work with unions, with other local organizing groups. I think this is a big ask for organizations that are used to speaking in a language of values and not in a language of finance. And you make a pretty strong case, I think, early on in the book that this should be the battleground on which we fight over these values and not necessarily on that culture war front, the curriculum front, where it so often typically plays out. I was wondering if you could maybe make that case for us here. Why should we lean into the wonky world of school finance?
I opened the book with a kind of image that came to me when I was starting to think about how to frame all the stuff that I've learned. And it's the image of a tug of war. And the tug of war is, it's a game, right? Okay, but it's a game of force. And the game of force is happening between, two sides more or less along a spectrum. And there are people pulling on either end of this rope. And, if we think of the rope as public schools, the right side of the rope or whatever has been just like really dragging the left side, and the center has basically just been going along with it. Whether or not they're being pulled because they're feckless or they actually just agree with the right wing, like that's the reality of it. Since Democrats, basically gave up supporting teachers unions across the board in the neoliberal period, and so the case here to some degree is the right wing is just pulling and pulling and pulling, and who knows what abyss we're all going to fall off if they keep pulling. They've got this sort of techno-fascist theocratic thing going on. But in the image that I try to use in the book is that underneath the feet of the pullers of this rope, there's a whole subterranean plumbing system of flows, pipes and the like. And I try to say, like, what's propping up this entire tug of war? What makes this sort of even sort of possible? What's the terrain here? What's the landscape that this sort of constant fight is happening on? That's the terrain of the school finance. And I think when you fight on that, you can actually pull it's another image, and there's no rugs in tug of war necessarily, but you can pull the rug out. You can get underneath this issue in a way that I just think, I'm sort of tired. Like, I'm tired having been on the left now for a while in education, and the refrain has been protect public schools, reclaim public schools, protect, reclaim, protect, reclaim. Like, no, like we need to transform this. Like, we need to go on the offensive. We're always in this defensive position, and it's the right wing somehow that is always the ones who have this agentic creativity with respect to the very fundament of how these schools get the material resources that they need to function. Whether it's like, complex tax loopholes for these quote unquote scholarship programs that have now morphed into vouchers, or, the like positively postmodern juridical and financial realities that are charter schools, which are just sort of real estate development, with these classroom arms. Like, we can do that too. And I think that the case to be made here to get to fight wonky, as I put it in the book, is to really try to go to the material conditions of the existence of these schools and fight from there, rather than constantly, protecting and trying to reclaim ground. I think we can maybe try to even change the whole terrain by examining what's going on under the surface there. And just one example that comes to mind here that I actually didn't get a chance to write about in the book, but I can tell you here. There is a really fascinating moment from the Virginia governor's race. Youngkin was running, okay? And it was a bit, everyone was watching this race as a sort of bellwether. And there was a CNN town hall. And this sort of culture war stuff was just really, really out in the open at that point. And I'll never forget, and I teach this clip a lot. During that town hall on national television, a white man with like a just the corniest perfect haircut you can imagine, bright blue eyes, stands up, grabs the microphone and asks Glenn Youngkin a question. And this man says, "I'm a trans man, and your policies say that I have to use the girls' bathroom. Do you think that makes any sense?" And there's a moment when Glenn Youngkin, who's just been pushing this awful transphobic stuff, you can see it for about half a second. He can't compute what's going on, because the student has really brought the reality of his existence, to confront him. And what Youngkin says is, I just think we need more bathrooms. And he's just trying to save it. He's just trying to get it together. And ultimately he says, yeah, I think we need to build more bathrooms. And like, that to me was a really interesting moment where this sort of what we call culture war, a war perhaps over what you could call recognition politics, actually has this material politics substrate, infrastructural underpinning, which is actually like, yeah, build more bathrooms for all the kids, like, so that no matter who you are, like, you can use the bathroom that suits who you are. But how do more bathrooms? I wonder, how do more bathrooms get built? And I thought about the movements to protect trans kids' lives and the movements to gain that recognition politics, and then, what trans activists call bathroom politics. We have to engage with municipal bonds for that project. And we have to say, we need the money and the technical knowledge, and we need the resources to be able to construct facilities that are appropriate for the gender and sexuality experiences of our students, to properly recognize them and provide nourishing education for everyone. And so, what would it be like for those movements to start talking about bonds and start talking about the Virginia Public School Authority and how they pool? In Virginia, they actually pool risk such that districts can go to that authority to borrow, and not as many districts use it as should. And perhaps that public authority needs more resources, and how we can demand more resources so that we can get the bathrooms for that sort of student. And so that story seems to me like, what I call in the book constructive politics, right? Where what the right is trying to do is just trying to tear all these things down. They're trying to tear people down. They're trying to tear the buildings down. They're trying to tear systems down. And it's really awful. So as I ask in the book, why not build? Okay, let's think about building this. Let's think about constructing a truly public education. But to do that, to do constructive politics, you got to start thinking about things like the bond market, because that's how it's all funded.
I don't suppose that the question that the person who is asking Youngkin asked next is, okay, how many millions of dollars are you willing to publicly commit to the cause of building bathrooms for transgender students? It just seems like we are so much more willing, and perhaps it's because it's just a more accessible fight, particularly in like the age of social media, to fight on like this amorphous turf of values, But I don't see that necessarily being a winning issue, because you can't really change your ideological opponent's values in this case without appealing to that or changing that person, right? I think that's how we've seen that story play out. However, we can get into that infrastructure of power that you're speaking to and actually make it work in favor of the values we're talking about. We don't have to defend the values. We can build the infrastructure that actually lives those values and implements them into practice. And I wonder if this is a place to actually, if I'm thinking about Youngkin and the millions spent in an alternative universe on transgender bathrooms, if that really was his policy solution. A local example here, again, a lot of breaking news on bonds and school finance in the state of Iowa, but the largest district, the Des Moines Public Schools District, just announced they're going to have to ask voters to approve a $265 million bond for renovations. And the consequence of not getting it, according to the interim superintendent, let's see here, he says, quote, hundreds of people could be laid off. So either get in on what is, $350 million bond that's going to add to property tax bills over the next 20 years, or lay off hundreds of staff, and you can't do the job of educating without that staff. I think, again, in a life before reading this book, I took bonds for granted. They feel pretty commonplace. You hear of bond issues, bond votes. I don't imagine it's a very popular place for electoral politics. We just sort of, it's just the water that we swim in. But like, why, if schools are publicly funded, do they need these bonds? What are these bonds? And how does this system of school funding via Wall Street create debtor schools? And to whom are they indebted to?
This is the question.
This is the question.
Particularly the way that you're phrasing it, and the situation that you've mapped out in Iowa. That's the situation that school districts have been in, not since 1970, but since 1870, maybe even before that. The first school bond that I've been able to find, and there's no history of the school bond, even though school bonds, this municipal bond market in the United States is $4 trillion big, maybe about $5 trillion. It's got about 1.5 million different issuances. And 27% of that market is education bonds. Now, that includes higher education, but that's the plurality. That's larger than, quote, general purpose, unquote. This municipal bond market is a huge market. And what does this market do? Okay, so I think the best way to explain it is this way. There's a difference in school finance between operating expenditure and capital expenditure. OPEX, CapEx. Now, the difference, like for you and me, and there's a clear analogy. For you and me, when we buy our food, when we buy our clothes, when we pay our rent on a regular monthly basis, or hopefully not buying clothes every month, but maybe some people need to, like regular line item kind of expenses, salary. And when it comes to education, we're talking salaries, benefits, materials. Okay, those are regular, whether it's yearly or monthly or even weekly expenses. We guide our income flows towards that expenditure. Revenue comes in, we expend. Okay. But every so often, as we all know, there are costs that confront us that are not those regular, temporally paced expenses. They're bigger expenses. So for you and me, like we want to buy a car, you want to buy a house, you want to go to school, you want to go to higher education, you want to get married. Those are big, irregular expenses. And there's a word in the school finance literature for this, which I really like, which is lumpy. It's lumpy cost, because I think the trend lines get lumpy, right? Because it's da-da-da-da-da-da, and then whoop, it goes up, right? There's lumps. This is how costs are, right? Like there are regular costs and then there are lumpy costs. Those lumpy costs are capital intensive. Capital intensive in that sense, meaning like you need a lot of money. You need a lot of resources to be able to account for it. Like the cost of, when it comes to school districts, the cost of a new roof, the cost of a new school building, the cost of repaving your parking lot, your HVAC system, your playgrounds. Like those are big costs that just come down the line, that are different kinds of costs that require different kinds of resources at a different kind of pace than the payment of your salaries, the payments of your benefits. Okay, so the question then becomes, okay, how do you finance? How do you pay for those lumpy costs? And in the United States, the way that we've decided to do it is to treat school districts like private businesses who need to get liquidity on a private credit market. So we treat it as a credit problem. And not only that, we treat it as a private credit problem. And again, this is the way that it's been time immemorial. Now, the bonds have looked different, the loans have looked different, the market has looked different and changed. But again, the first one that I found is in 1837 in Kentucky. That's the first time a school district had to take out a loan and pay it back with interest. Now, how does it work? 2/3 of school districts are out on their own, individualized. They have to go to a market called the municipal bond market, and they have to sell themselves. Okay, so it's like a bond is a loan that you get. It's money that you borrow. But the reason why it's called a bond is because it's a large like security where you're promising to pay a series of investors who have given you money with a price, interest rate. And it's like a security because they're going to feel secure that you're going to pay them back, and you're going to feel secure that they're going to lend you that money that you need for your HVAC, for your new playground. Now, these bonds, they're in the hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars if you get to school districts that are really big, like in New York City where I live. And so school districts, another story I tell in the book is when I taught a leadership class for students who wanted to become school principals. And it was a law and finance class. And I brought them to the Bloomberg terminals at my university. A Bloomberg terminal is a computer that all the finance bros use. They're all glued to them because this has up-to-date financial data for investors. If you want to make money as an investor, you need your Bloomberg terminal. You can find your public school districts on a Bloomberg terminal. Why? Because they are investments on Wall Street that people put their money into to be able to make interest profits on. And all the school bonds will have a yield, and that's the amount of money that the investors are going to make. And who are the big in-betweens? Well, it's the big private banks. So if you look at the bond statements that are publicly available for your school districts, you'll see Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Bank of America. Those are the underwriters. And the underwriters take something called an underwriter's discount, which is never like fully actually listed or invoiced. It's never clear how much the private banks get. Your school district has a credit rating. And there are school districts in this country like Philadelphia, where I learned about all this stuff for the first time, that were considered junk investments, because if your bond is beneath a certain threshold on the credit rating scale, then you're considered a junk investment. You're riskier. Even though it turns out that school districts are just not like businesses. They don't close down and open up. It's like a completely different. Anyway, I could go on and on about this stuff. So the reason why Iowa is in that situation, the reason why Des Moines is in that situation, is because they have some kind of set of costs that are lumpy, and there's no place for them to get those resources otherwise. There's no national program. There's no federal law. There's no resources or grants paid in kind. There's no schools infrastructure policy. The only school infrastructure policy that exists is something called the tax exemption for interest paid on municipal bonds. What does that mean? It means that the government chooses not to tax you if you're an investor that fronts up money to a municipality when they need the money for the bond. So if I give $100 to a municipal bond as an investor, and the yield is like 3%, I make back $103 when the time comes. The $3 I made are tax-free. That's the school infrastructure policy we have in this country. Who are the investors? Guess who these people are? These people are very wealthy. They're largely older retirees who want what they call fixed rate returns. So they want to be sure that they're going to get a certain return without the fluctuations of the market. So rather than risking getting an 11% return, which would be really high, versus losing money on the stock market, they'll go for like a 3 or 4% yield on one of these municipal bonds because it's regular. That's how we do it. And school districts, if you've ever been in a movement and you've ever been in a situation where you're demanding that your school district do something that would cost more money, you're probably familiar to some degree with the feeling of the superintendent or the school board looking over to the CFO or the business office or who's ever in charge of the money, and then the person who's in charge of the money saying something about the district's credit rating, or saying something about the district's debt payments, or saying something about the district's ability to, the costs of borrowing. That's what happens here, right? Because the district is always, even though the debt payments, they range between 8 and 10% of the budget each year. It's not a huge amount, but also like 10% of your school budget, like in New York City, that's $3 billion. Last year, there was a $3 billion debt payment that the school district made just on its debt service. But the thing is, even though that's sort of quantitatively small, between 8 and 10%, qualitatively, the experience of being in the district budget office is basically having like a kind of fiscal gun to your head, where if you do anything out of line, whether your reserves aren't high enough, whether you've spent too much on curriculum materials, whether you've literally opening charter schools in your districts lowers your credit rating. So if they make any kind of wrong move, they could have a credit rating problem. If the credit rating is lowered, that means that their borrowing costs are higher. It means that the property values in the district goes down. It means that all of the ways in which the school district is networked with the local property markets is impacted. They cannot have that. They don't want to have any undue attention on them that would question their fiduciary kind of responsibilities, fiscal responsibilities. So, as I say in the book, it's a sort of a hidden force of educational injustice. The bonds are the most powerful thing nobody's ever heard of.
And it seems like it really sets up this perverse incentive, or I guess a negative feedback loop, in the sense where I hear on the front end all the time that, state and local governments want to cut the tax burden for, individuals. They want to cut business tax rates to draw in greater investment into the state. And so that lowers the pool of money that schools have to draw from on the front end. But then on the back end, those same people can take the money that they got, say, through these tax breaks, invest them into these municipal bond markets, and end up as creditors to these large urban schools, or to whomever, to which then the tax base, the taxpayers, then also become their creditors sort of by default, because when the taxpayers end up paying their property taxes, those are going to schools who are taking that 10% to finance their debt, and that's going tax-free back into the pocket of those investors. So it's like they've developed this free money hack where they can get them to cut taxes on the front end and get tax-free profits on the back end. Meanwhile, right, they're literally, it's like a tax on households by virtue of raising their local property taxes. I don't know. I felt like a crazy person while I was reading through that to say this really can't be how the system works, right? But like you said at the top, $4 trillion. It's the largest market for these kinds of bonds is in these municipal bonds, with schools, to your point, K-12 through higher ed, as the premier borrowers. It literally defies reason and rationality.
Yeah, it's once you start connecting that, it's like that meme from Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where
Pepe
Charlie's
Sylvia.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you start thinking about it that way, and the loops just sort of continue. Like, for instance, Linda McMahon, the former head of the World Wrestling Federation, who's our esteemed Secretary of Education, she's deep into municipal bonds too. There was an article about on this on Chalkbeat. I can't remember the amount of money exactly, but she's invested in this. She's destroying the system and also extracting the resources from those school districts at the same time. And there's another chapter in my book where I talk about the relationship between municipal bond markets at the state level, private banks, and the gun industry, for instance. So these sort of looping flows that you were just talking about reminded me of that. And I tell the story of the shooting in Uvalde and how in the sort of post-mortem on that, they figured out that it was a faulty door lock, or a door lock that wasn't locking from both sides, that helped this shooter get into the school with an automatic rifle and kill all the kids and their teachers, right? It turns out that the funding flows and the relationship of private banks, the funding flows that fund that faulty door lock and that also fund the companies that create the rifles and sell those rifles on the mass market, they're connected through the same private banks. And Texas in 2021 made it illegal for banks that, quote, discriminated, unquote, against the gun industry to do business in Texas municipal bonds, which means that, for instance, Citibank, who had like the best rating in terms of their from advocacy groups who were evaluating banks and their willingness to defund a gun industry, who sell weapons on the mass market that are by and large the kind of weapons that are used in school shootings. The Texas municipal bond market's the second largest bond market in the country. And there was something on the order of $300 or $400 million made just in fees from that bond market for these big banks. And so Citibank, which, had tried to pose itself as being, committed to this, made a statement to the Texas state government saying, we in no way discriminate against the gun industry and we work with the gun industry regularly. So it's, I think if there were different systems for financing school facilities, then there perhaps wouldn't have been this kind of terrifying dual kind of pressure created by the private banks and their financing of the gun industry and also their financing of the school facilities in this way. And there's all kinds of connections like that
Right.
in this world once you start sort of following it.
The idea that the fear and terror that drives the gun industry, they might get a loan in order to expand a factory or something, right, to help meet the demand for guns. Well, at the same time, then the school goes to that same borrower, right? And the banks are benefiting from both of these things to say, okay, I'm benefiting from the growth of the gun industry. And then as a school, to update my security measures to combat the risk and fear of guns, increase security or buy better door locks, I'm going to that same bank and borrowing that money. Just again, this sort of negative feedback loop of perverse incentives that, on the flip side of all of this, it doesn't work like this everywhere, right? There are more sort of sane or rational ways that you write about as well, that some municipalities have figured out how to essentially build up an insurance policy for these lumpy costs when they come up, through some sort of like cost sharing or risk mitigation by pooling resources together, or sort of spreading the tax base around more equitably so schools can weather that storm. First, let's name those places so people can find and learn more about them. But then what is it that they do that helps mitigate that in ways that other places don't? What are they doing right?
There's certain kinds of issues in the book. I try to have this kind of rhythm where throughout the chapter I'll kind of critique the status quo and then punctuate the end of it with a kind of policy that I think is the one that we should have. And there are different issues that the different policies I think address. Now, there's the issue of the way in which racialized private property markets influence taxes and revenues for school districts. And then there's the issue of the municipal bond market. And I think different. I mean, we want a suite of policies, and at the end of the book, I try to sketch out a plan for public education that would have a suite of policies to address all the issues, including taxes and the like. And so when it comes to the municipal bond market, I think the thing that I think would be really great to do is, in general, would be to have a national investment authority. Then what you'd have is a third pillar of the country's financial system. You'd have the Treasury, the Fed, and the National Investment Authority. And like when it comes to lumpy costs in the literature, there's this idea of patient capital, and patient capital is the kind of capital that would be invested in the kinds of public infrastructures from which multiple generations of people would benefit, in a way that kind of challenges and maybe violates the more impatient kinds of capital that we're used to, where the people who are fronting the money or investing in something would see that return in the same kind of generation or the same decade. Like you would get to see your investment, right? Patient capital is the capital that's required, like for school buildings, and school buildings that that educated your grandparents, your parents, investing in that kind of what authors like Salih Omarova and Robert Hockett call collective goods. It's different than a public good. The collective good is the one that is this kind of public infrastructure that requires very patient capital, and we need institutions that can properly provide that patient capital. And right now, what we have is an impatient capitalist system that's trying to finance patient, public, collective goods. And so a lot of the schools are really hurting because of that mismatch. It's just like it's a category mistake to think that this kind of system of impatient capital can finance our patient needs for collective infrastructure. And that doesn't, it's not just school buildings, it's all kinds of public infrastructure. I'll say that, like, some of the stuff that was in the Inflation Reduction Act that's been recently gutted was quite exciting on this score. I'm not super pumped about everything about that law, but there were parts of it that were really great. And there were two things, that I'll talk about, and I talk about in the book too. One of them were these tax credits, and the tax credits reimbursed school districts up to 60% for green infrastructure expenditure. And that's basically like you get a mail-in rebate. It's like if a school district wants to put solar panels on their roof, like so many school districts started doing, then they could look to the federal government to get between 30%, 60% reimbursement for that, which makes a huge, huge difference to a school district, not only in the moment for the expenditure on those solar panels, but like over time, because solar panels are more efficient. You can get savings just by using these alternative sources on your utility costs, which, by the way, are increasing. The utility costs of water and electricity are only going up because of these AI data centers. And so having that tax credit structure was really great, because then school districts could say, hey, I can put in a ground source heat pump or an electric heat pump, and I could save money on my costs going forward because it's cheaper than oil and gas. And also I can get reimbursement from the federal government. But also, guess what? Like with the green stuff, like it won't put as much carbon into the atmosphere that's going to ruin the future that we're supposed to be preparing our kids for in these buildings. And educators are sensitive to that. Okay, like they understand that, that this climate issue it's like actually undermining their very purpose in their jobs. And so the tax credits in the IRA were cool, but I think even cooler was the green bank capitalization. I really am a big fan of green banks, and green banks are like, bank is sort of a misnomer. It's more of an investment fund. And what it does is, and for education audiences, this is the line I use, like, green banks are reverse charter schools. And the reason why they're reverse charter schools is because, like, whereas the charter school takes public money and funnels it into the private sector, the green bank takes private money and funnels it for the public purpose. And, for the capitalists, the green infrastructure and public infrastructure, the price is always wrong, right? Like, it's not a good investment. They're not going to make as much money as possible because they make, as much money as they can, ruining the world. But like the green bank helps them and de-risks it for them in a way that I think is cool, in ways that we can work with. And so I think, more policies that provide these kind of tax credits, more policies that empower the green bank, are ways in which we can take on this municipal bond market. And I think you can get pensions involved in that too, and you can start actually using the public's money for the public's infrastructure in these ways that actually don't require the federal government. So if we can't rely on the federal government anymore, maybe we need to start thinking about how we can get sort of state and local money sort of virtuously cycling and building on itself.
Zooming out to the federal level, I think we typically think of the federal government stepping in to support special education funding, Title I. They're filling what we might call those equity gaps in different state and local budgets. But you liken federal funding in the book to, quote, different sized spoons that dole out money from a cracked and uneven pot. I love that visual metaphor. So what's happening in that metaphor, and how does federal money get allocated to schools in the strange way that these don't live up to the expectation that we have for them?
In some ways, I wrote this book in a time before January 2025, and as quickly as things have changed, I've also had to kind of adapt my own thinking to it, and trying to keep up with the sort of terrible speed of the changes happening in the federal government, trying to be able to name what's going on in a way that's helpful. Like, before, I would have said, and I think it's also still more or less true, that the federal government's contribution is qualitatively important and quantitatively pitiful. On average, the federal government funds, public education about 8% of a school's budget. It's just not much at all. And another way of thinking about this, for instance, is, on average, Title I-A, which provides federal monies for poor, districts that serve poor students. On average, in 2015, which is the last kind of massive study we had of it, it was about $1,200 per student that it provided. On average, school districts were spending $12,000 per student. Okay. But that $1,200 still means something. I don't want to say it doesn't mean anything. I'm really very, I want to say that it actually, when it comes to school finance, what these district officials are trying to do is they're trying to pay for what's needed. And a little bit helps, okay? But also, when you're missing a little bit, it also makes a big difference. And so what was going on with the federal government was essentially this dynamic of, in crisis moments, the government steps in and sends in money. And historically, those crisis moments have always been linked to war. So, the first time the federal government decided to fund public education was actually in the wake of World War I, when they saw that all their white boys that they were sending overseas were actually quite sickly and illiterate. And so they thought to themselves, well, if we want to project power, we better have a school system that, builds up these soldiers we want to send into the maws of death.
They weren't quite living up to the doughboy stereotype, it sounds like.
No, right? And so that's a big moment of federal intervention in school funding. Another big moment of federal intervention in school funding: Sputnik. Okay, Cold War, fighting communism, right? Like, the Russians send a satellite into space for the first time, and everyone in the U.S. starts freaking out that the communists are ahead of the game and that they're going to win the Cold War. So they're like, well, we better fund our education system. Okay, again, context of war. And just, I guess as a footnote there too, like, I like just telling people, Brown versus Board of Education, what's seen as a crowning achievement of the civil rights movement, that happens in 1954, a good 10 years before a lot of the action we see in what's ultimately the second civil rights movement. The justices and the federal government this is according to Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, whose work I really love. He was a member of the NAACP trying the busing cases and the integration cases. He wrote a couple essays that were groundbreaking, and he said, listen, why do you think that it happened in 1954? It happens in 1954 because a couple of those Supreme Court justices did a world tour, and in much of the world that was contested between the Soviet bloc and the United States, they kept hearing a refrain, which is, you keep saying that you're supposed to be a bastion of freedom in the world, but look at how you treat your people of color. Look at how you treat your Black communities. How could you project an image of freedom and equality on the world stage against communism when you treat your people so terribly in terms of racial segregation in the schools, right? So it was the local school buildings in segregation that ultimately made these people think to themselves, well, hey, we better get our act together in terms of integration, or else we're going to lose a Cold War against the communists. And like, that's when the federal government feels, the need to get involved, right? And most recently, we saw the CARES Act, and that was a global pandemic. Okay, so that it wasn't a war in the same way, but in a way, it was a sort of existential threat, and so the federal government steps in. Otherwise, the legacy that we have of the Great Society legislation from Lyndon B. Johnson and ESEA, the titles of those Title I and Title II and Title III and Title IV, like, that's the legacy of the civil rights movement, and that funding has been it's just been undermined. It's been compromised. I guess I'll use the word compromised, because in the years since the civil rights movement, what you've seen, like, starting from LBJ himself, even when he was a vice president with JFK, when they started undoing FDR's economic policies, like, onward, what we've seen is just a constant compromising on that vision, constantly just giving into, oh, we can't spend this, we shouldn't spend that, who's getting this money, it's just the diverse working class kids of color in the cities, like, and over again. And like, Title I that I talk about in the book, if you start looking at the history of it, it's got these 4 formulas, and the 4 formulas have been added, they've been weakened, they've been this and they've been that. They've tried to be more generous, and that generosity has been taken back over and over again. And so you get this, like, image, that you say, that I try to write about in the book, of this cracked pot with these differently sized spoons, where Idaho students get $800 of money for poor students, whereas Vermont poor students get $2,000. It's like the formulas dice things up and slice them up in ways nobody really knows about. But I'll just, getting back to the way that I sort of prefaced this response, like, the federal government now, I mean, even when I was writing the book, I thought, okay, the big threat here is that what they would do is they would outsource the administration of the funding streams from the legislation to other departments, and get rid of the Department of Education. Okay, but just getting rid of the Department of Education doesn't mean that they get rid of the funding sources, right? Like it's just they're administered by HHS or the Department of Justice or the Department of Commerce. And like, fine. I mean, the Department of Education, that was a relic of Jimmy Carter. And the only reason the Republicans wanted to get rid of it was because Reagan was fond of saying, like, let's just get rid of it because that's what Carter did in the 1979, and 1980 presidential election. In any case, they could outsource it, but then they could do something also bad, which would be to make the categorical grants block grants, which would mean like taking these grants that are trying to target concentrations of poverty in different ways, and just sort of flatten it all out, give it to the state and say, use it for whatever the heck you want. I didn't know that they would just fire everyone. I didn't know that they would literally just it's even a more materialist intervention, right? It's like a terribly materialist thing. It's like, well, you don't want it, whatever. Like, we'll just fire everyone who's responsible for taking care of this stuff, and like maybe the money will go out, maybe it won't. Like in July, states across the they got an email a week before a big payment was supposed to come in from the federal government saying, "Oh, that money's not coming." You know what I mean? Like, so now everyone's just sort of knocked off balance, holding their breath, and they're dismantling it in a way that I wasn't even clear, would happen. But I guess, there's a way in which we should have seen it coming. We should have seen, Russ Vogt saying like, well, we're going to put them in trauma. We're going to remake this deep state or this administrative state. There are definitely valid left critiques of the federal government and its interventions, but like, it's in a much more chaotic, dire state than even when I was writing.
It is so interesting to see on the federal, and horrifying really to see at the federal level what seems to simultaneously just be like an abdication to support civil rights, right? And what they are legally required to spend on these programs, and for these students who are entitled by their civil rights to have a free and accessible public education. Right at the same time that their rhetoric, against DEI and all these other kinds of things, it shouldn't be surprising to us. But then alongside that abdication in the what's legally required part, there is a weaponization on the other hand, which is for us to give you money, right? You have to sign off on compacts in higher ed, or I've seen this at the state level here, local schools changing DEI policies because their lawyers tell them they'll be at risk of losing access to federal funds if they don't change the language of some, school board handbook or something. Now, I don't know, to what extent those are just tokenistic linguistic changes and you don't have to really change policy and practice. Like I completely understand that, but there just seems to be they're having their cake and eating it too at the federal level, in the sense of not wanting to do their legal responsibilities, but really caring a lot about how these other things get spent. Just like we did with the school bonds, talking about like, okay, what are some examples of ways to do this better, more humanely, in ways that make rational fiscal sense? I wonder if we could talk about like the value added tax idea. I think I had mentioned it in this introduction, but what really struck me about this, not only is it a policy tool that seemingly the rest of the world has, if you've, traveled abroad, you've paid a VAT, a value added tax on things that you buy, but it really seems like a really cool and unique compromise politically, while also providing like a really great policy tool to address the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Do you want to talk about the history and power of this intervention?
Yeah, sure. So the value added tax is a tax at different levels of production. And it historically is leveled on the supply side, not necessarily on the demand side. So, but you do pay that, as a consumer as well. But the structure of the tax is one that is also on the supply side, and rather than just like a sales tax, which is exclusively an excise tax, or it's paid at the point of the transaction of the money on the demand side, like you've got your VAT tax, which is taxing on the production side, and most countries in the world have some form of value added tax. It's a tax on the value add, right? When the value is added, we tax. Okay, and this is how governments all over the world, except for like Saudi Arabia, Greenland, and us, do it. And so the story of Richard Nixon's proposal of the value-added tax for education is quite interesting, and I was very surprised to come upon it myself. But in the days when, and I write about this in the book, in the days when school funding policy in the United States could have been something much better than it is, The situation in the early 1970s was this. So you had a 20-year kind of period of civil rights organizing that had brought a very significant legal challenge to the segregation and white supremacy in the United States. And there were court cases popping up everywhere. And the state Supreme Courts were finding that indeed the system of local property taxation was one that violated the equal rights. Like it violated, you just can't do that. That's illegal because it's the racialized communities with certain kinds of municipal revenue that can pay, and the other ones even right next door can't, and that's just not. That ain't legal, as they as they say. So Richard Nixon, like pretty crafty politician, sees this sort of coming, and then there's a huge case in California in 1971 called Serrano versus Priest, and California, biggest state in the country, finds that it is in fact illegal. This is bad. It's wrong. And when you have a kind of accumulation of cases like that, then what you have is a tendency or a kind of pressure on the federal and the Supreme Court to decide in their favor, because that's where the states are all headed. And Richard Nixon is sort of like, well, if they're going to be challenging this at the federal level and we're going to have to do something about it, why don't we head them off at the pass and try to at least take control of the situation, and in a way that will make the advocates happy, but also not have to really give up our white supremacist system or something. He was trying to find ways to figure out how to accommodate, like how to how to find settlements, I guess, within this conjunction in this crisis. And he said, why don't we do a VAT? Let's just do a VAT. We'll take it away. We won't have the property tax. We'll do a VAT, and we'll fund schools this way. And it's a really interesting history because, there were these reports that were written that were just like, you can't do this. This is a terrible tax on the supply side. Like we're your constituency, the business community, we won't have it. And Nixon scuttled it. And then in a couple of years, it turned out Rodriguez passed at the Supreme Court level, where the Supreme Court decided that because the word education doesn't appear in the federal constitution, the federal government has no obligation to fund it. And that, combined with the case in Milliken, where there was no responsibility to deal with disparities across district lines, then the case was closed. Richard Nixon didn't have to worry about it anymore. We could keep that whole system in place because the federal government just said, well, the word isn't there, so we don't have to pay for it. But it's an interesting moment in history, and so I think we can think about that stuff. But I just want to say too, as a postscript, and I try to qualify it in the book, and I didn't know exactly how far to get into it, but I think the modern monetary theorists are really right when it comes to federal government. And we can fund whatever we want. We can fund whatever priorities we have. So it's not a matter, I don't think the VAT tax I wouldn't want to say that it's going to pay for it, because that's not how it works. The government just prints and budgets and finances the money for its budget for whatever it wants to do. Okay. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have taxes, and that actually taxes control inflation, and also keep money, keep maintaining a sort of balance and political power. Having a VAT tax, I think, would do that. So, that's why I think having a VAT tax is an interesting way to explore this at the federal level. And this idea, for people who think at some point we're going to take power back in the federal government, it's an idea, I think, to keep in your pocket.
The notion that it could bring together coalitions of people who hate paying local property taxes, right? Which I imagine are wealthier people, a huge portion of the middle class who are homeowners, who maybe send their kids to public schools, but who might find themselves, part of a fiscal conservative and socially conservative coalition, right? It's an offer to that to then say, okay, we're going to then leverage that at the federal level. At least it sounds like in Nixon's time, as a way to sort of shift the power away from, what we know was happening locally on the ground for cities and principalities. Jesus, I was an AP Euro teacher. Municipalities to right maintain those systems of segregation. This was like a way for the federal government to leverage more of that to mitigate that. So yeah, there really is a lot of power there. I think both in terms of a political strategy to potentially build coalitions with groups on the issue of supporting public education. And then it sounds like a pretty effective, again, it's not going to be a panacea, but a pretty effective fiscal tool to help address these inequalities. Although it does sound, you mentioned these Supreme Court precedents too, that there are perhaps some barriers before we get there. At the same time, I'll say there's been a lot that has happened in the last 9 months that hasn't necessarily followed precedent or hasn't had lawyers preemptively shutting it down to avoid court decisions. So maybe again, lawful good federal government at some point could come in and use those same powers. On the other hand, but that's again a slightly different political conversation. But I love that you insert that into the toolkit, just setting that on the table and saying, here's something that was tried or explored at a certain time, and maybe now is the moment to pick that tool up. If it wasn't the right political moment back in when Nixon had proposed it or thought of it, maybe that time is now. But your book, right, just gives us these ideas to think differently about school finance and the way of funding public schools as a way to, I don't know, expand our horizons of thinking about it. I think right now we're so trapped in this claustrophobic present that I really appreciate those ways of opening the door, not on, again, the battlefront of values and culture wars, but through this different way of leveraging our values through economic power. What do you want the closing message of this conversation to be, perhaps for people who go on to pick up your book or want to explore these issues, more deeply?
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, honestly, like what you just said was such a great summary of what I'm trying to do with the book, right? Which is to take what seems like a claustrophobic situation and create space to, like Marx says, wrest freedom from necessity, right? Where whatever seems like it has to be actually need not be, and gives us opportunities to change things and make it better. And I think to some degree, I'm trying to bring this, arcane but extremely important set of financial policies to light to show that we can actually work there too. And the way you said it was great. It's we're trying to open up new senses of possibility in an otherwise bleak, claustrophobic landscape. And I think that there are ways of using the money to do it.
I want to share this anecdote real quick because I was at an organizing event for Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement earlier in the week. And, I happened to have the physical copy of your book with me and all my notes. And as we went around the table and people were introducing themselves, said, "Hey, I'm Nick Covington, here's what I do." And the question that we were supposed to answer is like, "Well, why are you here? Why do you support this public school strong movement?" And, I was weighing all of the tensions and the competing forces in my head over the course of the week from that DOGE report, right? And then the vision in your book, the kinds of things that you heard as I was, dealing with them in the introduction as well. But the thing that I had talked about is, the entire time I was in the classroom teaching, my entire time now that my kids are in public schools has been like demanding that these public schools do more with less, do more with less, do more with less. And you're very plain in this book to say like schools need money to do well, and schools that have money do more and do better. And I leverage that in that conversation to say like I want the permission to demand that our schools do more with more instead of try to do more with less. This hypocritical way of putting more and more in our schools and less amount of funding on there. I want them to be thriving public schools where kids have access not just to sustenance level food and intellectual and physical and emotional safety and security, but really can thrive in a lot of different areas, to have access to robust art and music and clubs and extracurriculars and course offerings and, well paid adults who can, live comfortably in the communities in which they teach, and have parents who don't have to stress out so much because, they're supported in this as well. I just think, again, your book is a wonderful off-ramp to the permission to demand that, fiscally and financially, that investment from state, local, and from the federal government, regardless of the timeline of getting it. I'm not going to let reality impinge on this just yet, but I think that basic permission it from your book was a really powerful thing to lean into, and perhaps as listeners go and they read the book, they can bring that message into their communities too.
I mean, what you just did was you fleshed out the concept of what public education should be. What does it mean to have public education for all? That's what you just said. That's what you just described. What we need are financing policies that can provide that can finance that. And what my book is about is are those policies, and why the policies we have now aren't those policies, which means that the education we want now isn't that education.
Yeah.
And that's why I called it as public as possible, because we actually we don't want to protect our public schools. We want our public schools to be as public as possible. And this is, I think, how to fund it.
Well, that's the book, As Public as Possible, Radical Finance for America's Public Schools. The author is David Backer. You can pre-order it from the New Press. And in just my personal opinion, I think we need more philosopher school finance experts. So thanks, Dave, for sharing your work with us today.
Thank you so much, Nick. It was a really great conversation.
Thank you again for listening to our podcast at Human Restoration Project. I hope this conversation leaves you inspired and ready to start making change. If you enjoyed listening, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast player. Plus, find a whole host of free resources, writings, and other podcasts all for free on our website, humanrestorationproject.org. Thank you.